What happens the day after Isaias Afwerki leaves us? I think this is a question that we need to ask ourselves more often. We need to ponder it. We need to think about it. We need to imagine it. Why? Well, simply put, when you look at the current discourse around Eritrea, well, what do you see? If you're on the anti side, you ask questions like, well, why is it that the country hasn't had elections? And who is it that we come back to? Isaias Afwerki. Why hasn't there been a constitution? Because of Isaias Afwerki. Why is it that people are fleeing the country, all of these young people? Because of Isaias Afwerki. The same on the pro side. You ask, why is it that Eritrea has made headways on these millennial development goals? Isaias is to be credited here. Why is it that Eritrea has managed to be self-sufficient and not be riddled with debt? Because of Isaias Afwerki. Why is it that Eritrea became independent? Because of Isaias Afwerki. So no matter if you're pro or if you're anti, ultimately anything to do with Eritrea will come back to Isaias Afwerki. But here's the problem. Isaias doesn't look like this, or this, or this. No, Isaias Afwerki looks like this today. February 2021, Isaias Afwerki will be 75 years old. He's an elder statesman, or put bluntly, he's old. By comparison, UN projected life expectancy for people born in Africa now, not during Isaias' time, but now, 62 years old. Now you may say that's not a good comparison because Isaias has better access to medical services. Okay, well here are the projected life expectancy for people born in Europe now, 78 years old. Notice, Isaias is getting very close to that number. So our entire discourse that centers around Isaias Afwerki, whether you're pro or anti, nature will soon take away that centerpiece. He will die. And then what happens? Well, you may think to yourself, if you're on the pro side, right, you might see things like this. The party mobilizing people, especially abroad in the diaspora. You have images like this, where people attend the conferences, young people in great numbers, right? The People's Front for Democracy and Justice is alive, it's doing well. And so you think to yourself, well, okay, PFDJ, the party is strong. It's going to be strong even after Isaias. But is it though? Now, of course, that's a question that only time can really tell what happens. But what we can do is take a broader view and ask, well, what happens to other places that have similar kinds of regimes? And so here, what I want to do is just show you some descriptive data by an article of Professor Annie Meng. Professor Meng is collecting or has collected data on these one-party regimes. So kind of like what we're seeing in Eritrea, or sort of the most prominent example, contemporary speaking, will be the Chinese Communist Party. So here we're talking about states that have one party de facto. So for all intents and purposes, for instance, in Eritrea, we would not expect there to be another party that would displace the incumbent party. And that's the focus of this paper. And she brings to bear some very interesting results that are really relevant for thinking about post-Isaias Eritrea. And I just want to share some of her results here. So on the x-axis, what you have is a simple question that is, for any given one-party regime, the question is, how long did that regime manage to stay in power? On the y-axis, the question is, well, how many of regimes do we observe at that time point? And so here are the results. In this first bin, the vast majority managed to stay in power somewhere before 5 years. The second bin, that is up to 10 years, starting to see even fewer make it that far. So there's a stark drop in the number of regimes that even make it this far. And if we show the entire data, here's what you're seeing. Most of the regimes don't really make it that far. And right here is where the PFDJ would fall into place, right in this bit. So now we can ask the more important question. What happens, or how long do those one-party states or regimes stay in power after their founding leader is no longer there? Okay, so in our case, the question would be, how long does the PFDJ stay in power after Isaias has left? And so again, this is just looking at the data. Here's what it looks like. And in fact, here's what I would like you to do. Take a second and ask yourself what you think this data looks like. All right, let me go ahead and show you the results. It looks like this. As you can see, the vast majority of these regimes all fall apart after 5 years. That's the first bit. We can see that in fact, when we ask the question, how many of these regimes make it past 5 years? This is not long. 5 years past the founding ruler, we drop down to only 40%. If we ask the question, how many make it past 9 years? Now we're starting to drop down to 33%. Again, we see a stark drop. And so we can even take it further. And we can ask the question, okay, not only how long do you remain in power after the founding leader has left, but how many leaders do you actually cycle through? So in the neighboring Ethiopia, as an example, we had first Meles Zenawi, then in 2012, replaced by Haile Mariam Desalegn, and in 2018, replaced by Abiy Ahmed. So this will be 3 leaders that the EPRDF cycled through before Abiy then changed the party itself. So now let's look at what we see in the data. So the question in this case, how many of these parties do we see that cycle through just one ruler? Here's the number. How many manage to cycle through more than one? So 2. Well, that number drops precipitously. Well, how many manage to cycle through 3? And the number gets even smaller. And here is the rest of the data. As you can see, that what we even saw with the EPRDF, that is rare. The majority of regimes don't manage to cycle through even beyond 1. So what does that tell us? Well, if you are pro-Isaias, you should be worried, because these ruling parties are actually much more fragile than we think. While they're in power, they can appear like they're really strong, but the moment the founding ruler leaves, they show their fragility. Now, if you are in the anti-Isaias camp, you might look at this and you get happy. You're like, that's right. Let's get rid of him. Get rid of Isaias. Good for that. Have the party just be removed and everything is going to be fine. But is that the case? Can we assume that simply getting rid of Isaias is going to usher in this period of prosperity? I'd say no. And here's the problem. The assumption oftentimes, I'd say the implicit assumption, is that yes, we might not know what that transition is, who is going to follow Isaias. But from history, we can tell that, well, when we transitioned from the Dirk in 1990, right, from Mengistu Haile Mariam to Isaias Afwerki, that was a smooth transition. There was no violence, it was peaceful. And so the assumption is, well, okay, we had a peaceful transition then, and therefore we're going to have a peaceful transition now, after Isaias. And I would say no, not at all. Here's why. Here is what the EPLF looked like, its executive committee. This is a committee or the leadership of the EPLF that has now, at the dawn of independence, been waging war for decades. It's a battle-hardened group that in many ways was quite cohesive. And you can see right here is Isaias Afwerki. He was only one of many. There was nothing special about him as such. In fact, if for whatever reason, Isaias would have been incapacitated, unable to take on the position of head of state, any one of these figures in this picture could have taken over, and the EPLF would have been just fine. It would have transitioned just fine. But here's the problem. The picture doesn't look like this anymore. Here's what it looks like instead. And Isaias has firmly planted himself in the middle, flanked by his other elites in the regime. He is in the middle with all of these other elites that are essentially tied to the regime, first and foremost through Isaias. He's the one that is brokering this relationship. And here's the problem. What happens when that chair suddenly is empty? Well, you think the elites are just going to sit back and say, okay, time to introduce elections? No. We know historically that once that seat of power becomes empty, what happens is a power struggle. And if that power struggle is not in some ways structured, reined in by rules, by institutions, that power struggle can easily spin out of control into outright conflict, if not war. And there's nothing unique about Eritrea in this case. We know that this is the case no matter where it is. When you have centralized power and suddenly that seat of power is empty, those elites have been linked to the ruler and not collaborating with each other. So why would they be collaborating with each other after the ruler has left? So all of this is to say, we come back to this question. Whether you are pro or anti-Isaias, you have got to ask yourself this question. What happens the day after Isaias Afwerki leaves us? It's a pressing question. It's a question that we should not leave to the day after he leaves us. We need to ponder it now so we can prepare and hopefully usher in a peaceful transition.